And so I want to tell you this story that I heard from a rabbi who was in Jerusalem. His name is Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson. And it's a man who grew up extremely close to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he heard this story directly from him. And it's a story about Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem in 1935. After Rabbi Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, passed away, Rabbi Frank took the position. So there to the left is Rabbi Kook, and to the right, that's Rav Pesach Tzvi Frank. And he was the next chief rabbi of Jerusalem. So he was the chief rabbi for many decades. And Rav Yaakov Frank, his grandson, told this story to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now, his grandson was born on 1929. And you see, in 1929, that time in Israel was a very tumultuous time. There were Arab riots and pogroms all across Israel. Hundreds of Jews were murdered by the Arabs in those years under the British mandate. And in 1929, the situation in Israel was getting worse. And there was a yeshiva student in Yeshivat Hebron, and his parents sent a telegram to the Rosh Yeshiva saying, listen, it's 1929. There's no yeshiva in America right now. We sent our child to Hebron, but right now we want him to come home. It's just too dangerous right now. And so in 1929, some people might say, but the Arab-Israeli conflict, it only started in 1967 when Israel won the Six-Day War. And it's like, no. The Arab-Muslim-Jewish conflict, when the Jews were minorities, it didn't start in 1967. Just in 1967, the minority of Jews defeated the Arab world for the first time. In 2,000 years, we were finally able to struck fear and awe into the enemies of Israel. But the conflict obviously was well before 1948. In 1929, we were just helpless and hopeless and relied on the British to protect us. And of course, the nations didn't protect us. And in 1929, there was a massacre. So the parents of this yeshiva, they wanted their boy back. And so the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Hebron asked Rav Tzvi Pesach Fink to intervene. And they said, well, maybe you know the rabbi of the shul in Philadelphia where this boy is from. He says, yes, I do know that rabbi. So please, we cannot lose this student. He's a budding Torah scholar. He's righteous. The Jewish people need leaders like this. Please tell him to tell the parents that Hebron is different. Hebron is safe. It's not like the rest of Israel. He'll be safe here. One of the leaders of Hebron, his name was Rav Elazar Slonim, and he spoke Arabic, and he was a banker, a wealthy man, very close with the Arabs. And people in Hebron felt protected because of his diplomatic relations with the Arabs. But when the pogrom started, all the Jews ran to his house, or many of the Jews ran to his house, and all the people in his home, his wife, his children, and everyone were murdered. But Rav Tzvi Pesach Fink, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, he was supposed to be in Hebron, that Sheva Brachot. He was supposed to be there on that Shabbat. But because his grandson was born, he stayed in Jerusalem because he was the sandak, the grandfather of his grandson's circumcision. And that Shabbat, the Hebron massacre happened. 69 Jews were axed to death. And 24 of them were the students of the yeshiva in Hebron. And so the rabbi, he never could forgive himself. He felt indirectly guilty. The parents were worried. They wanted him to come home, and he convinced his parents not to take him home. Like, why did he get involved? And now he felt like he had blood on his hands. He was like indirectly involved. Why did he do that? And it was like a heaviness that never left him. And that massacre in Hebron, I mean, if you look at the synagogue, if there's a picture of the Abraham synagogue, Beit Knesset Avram Avinu, they just ransacked the synagogue, and with axes and knives, they murdered the people of Israel. It wasn't like a clean death. It was a savage, barbaric massacre. And his grandson's bris is what saved the rabbi of Jerusalem. And so in 1960, this is 31 years later, the grandson is in Miluim. He's in the IDF reserve duty. And he's in a trench, it's raining, and some other soldier in the unit comes and gets into the same trench with him, and it's pouring on both of them. And, you're in reserve duty, so you meet the guy next to you. He's like, okay, who are you? Who am I? And he's like, oh, I'm Rabbi Fink. He's like, really, Fink? That connected to the chief rabbi of Jerusalem? Yes, like, yeah, I'm his grandson. He's like, well, who are you? He's like, well, listen, I'm actually a historian of the Jewish settlement in the land of Israel before the establishment of the state of Israel. And of course, he tells him the story, what happened in Hebron. I actually inadvertently saved my grandfather because of my circumcision. My grandfather was supposed to be there. And, he never forgave himself, just heartbroken that he never Why did he get involved? Why did he tell that? Like that American boy was killed indirectly because of him. And then the historian says, well, do you know the end of that story? And he said, what do you mean the end of the story? The boy died. He says, no, but there was a continuation to that story. The father of that boy was a very important diplomat in the United States, very close with many people in the State Department. He made such a ruckus for years, every day going to DC and convincing the State Department that the British are at fault. It was the British fault. The British were accomplices to the murder of this American civilian, to his son. They could have stopped it. They had guns. The Arabs didn't have guns. They could have protected the Jews, and they chose not to. And they were constantly choosing the Arabs over the Jews. And now look at what's happened. And because of the pressure of this father, the British changed the head of the British mandate in the land of Israel. And they replaced him with a man who's named Arthur Walkoff. And Arthur Walkoff, who arrived in the land of Israel, was the one in charge from 1931 to 1937. He was the commander of Palestine, of the land of Israel, in those years. And Arthur Walkoff, when he traveled around the land of Israel, he literally fell in love. He fell in love with Israel. He fell in love with the Jewish people. And in his tenure, he opened up the gates to any Jew that wanted to immigrate to Israel. At that time, 400,000 Jews escaped Europe, escaped Arab countries, and moved to Israel. And when Hitler rose to power, he quadrupled the land purchase in the land of Israel, and he quadrupled the number of Jews that were in the land of Israel. At that time, when he arrived, there's only 150,000 Jews in Israel. But by 1948, there were already 600,000 Jews. And he says, do you understand what Arthur Walkoff allowed? In 1948, that was the Independence Day War. 6,000 Jews died in that war. Had Arthur Walkoff not opened the gates to hundreds of thousands of Jews coming to the land of Israel, Israel would have never naturally won the war in 1948. The state of Israel as we know it today exists because of Arthur Walkoff, and he never would have taken office without what happened in Hebron and what happened to that boy from Philadelphia. He finished that story, and they finished their miluim because it was pouring rain. The grandson of Rabbi Fink said, I need to go to my grandfather's house and tell him this. And so Thursday night, he finished his army service, put on his civilian clothes, and charged off to his grandfather's house. He called his wife and said, listen, I'm coming home late because I'm going to my grandfather's house. And then the wife said, but you go to his grandfather's house every Shabbat. Why do you have to go Thursday night? He's like, I know what I know, and I know that he needs to know this as soon as possible. Thursday night, he went to his grandfather's house, told him the story. And the father, Rabbi Fink, said, you know, I can't believe it. You've taken a stone off of my chest. I will never forgive myself, but at least now I realize that there are things that I just don't know. And what does Mordechai say? Umi yodea, who knows? If you've come to the kingship at this time, ad delo yahada, you're supposed to drink until you don't know. Shabbat morning, the grandson went to go visit his grandfather. They said, no, you don't need to come. Shabbat morning, he passed away. And he was able to tell his grandfather that final message just a day before he passed away. And you see, sometimes we just don't know. There is a large master plan that's unfolding in our lives, that's unfolding in the world. And what Purim comes to teach us, all the hardships that we go through, all of the challenges, all of the obstacles we had to climb, and all the battles that we had to win, the scars that we still carry, like Jacob struggling with an angel, limps away from this with scars. God sends you to the depths because there were sparks of light that you had to find in the darkness that you needed to retrieve. La Yehudim Haita Ora, the Jews had light, V'simcha and joy, V'ikar, and then in the chaos of Vayikar, they were able to find God's plan.